Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to this show today. My name is Chef Andy, and today we're going to be working on something very locally Kenyan. We're going to be making a very simple Maharagwe ya nazi, which is basically beans and coconut milk, and we're also going to be pairing that with some beautiful coriander rice. But before we begin, I'll of course introduce the ingredients before us to give you an idea of what to expect for the show today. Now from the front, you will require about 1 heaped teaspoon of coriander powder. You'll also require about half a cup of basmati rice, 1 teaspoon of chili flakes, a small handful of some fresh coriander leaves, some garlic cloves, and some tomato paste. About 1 tablespoon will do for this recipe. You'll also require 2 medium-sized white onions or red onions if you can find either. You'll also require 1 cup of some soaked red beans, of course, a bit of some stock powder just to be able to give that a bit of a flavor. You're also going to require some salt for seasoning, about 3 medium-sized tomatoes, some turmeric powder just to give the rice a bit of color. You'll also require some vegetable stock, some oil to cook with, and last but not least, some coconut milk. But before we begin, we'll of course give you this chance to sit down, relax, and grab your notes if you're taking, grab your pens and papers if you're taking notes, and we'll see you after a very short break. Welcome back viewers. For those of you who are just tuning in, we are going to be making a very simple Maharagwe ya nazi, which is beans in coconut milk. And we're going to start off the process very simply by cooking our beans first. Now, as I had mentioned earlier in the show when we began, these have pretty much been soaking overnight. Of course, this process always makes it a little easier and cuts your time quite short, especially when cooking them the following day. So very important to mention, always soak them a bit in advance. Of course, if you don't have the time to do so, you can also proceed to cook in a pressure cooker, which will of course also save you quite a bit of time. So we're going to begin this process by adding our beans to our pot here. And to the mixture with the beans and water, I'm also going to add to that a little bit of my stock, making sure that your water level goes about double the level of your beans at this stage. And all you're going to do now is proceed to turn that on. And we're going to allow that to cook in our iron pot for quite a bit of time. So that should take anywhere between 20 minutes to 25 minutes. Of course, giving you quite a bit of time to be able to do everything else. Now, before we begin, I'm just going to wipe off the water from the counter. And we're going to start the process of making the rice very simply. Of course, what you will require is a pot, of course, to cook your rice in. So I'm going to measure out about a cup of some stock. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin to reheat that mixture. And to that we will proceed to add our coriander powder, just to give it a bit of time to infuse with the stock. We'll also season that with a bit of salt. And basically what we're going to do at this stage is allow the water to come to the boil before adding our rice. Now also to mention, if you are going to be using store-bought rice, remember this has probably been washed, but you can always take your time and do that very briefly under some running water. So I'm just going to rinse my rice very briefly. And as I mentioned, because we're using store-bought rice, this is probably as clean as you can be able to get rice at this stage. So we're going to just work our fingers right through the mixture. And you may also notice that the water will not be as murky as market-bought rice, of course. And all you're going to do is proceed to pour out your rice onto a strainer or a sieve. And we're going to allow that to drain very, very briefly just before we add that to our mixture with the coriander and the stock. And of course, that will of course give you time as well to proceed to prepare the rest of the ingredients. So we're going to start off by chopping up a white onion. Now this you want to chop as fine as you possibly can. Proceed to slice down the root end as well, but always make sure to core your onions before chopping. Just proceed to finish off your white onion as you did for the first half. Right, so once that is done, we're also going to prepare our tomatoes. So very, very simply, begin by coring out the eye of the tomato with a very small knife. And you can do so for about 2 medium to large pieces. And you can proceed to discard those. You can also grab a plate at this stage and you can possibly begin to just make some space on your chopping board. Right, very simple. Now next up we're going to chop up our tomatoes. So I'm going to begin by quartering that very, very simply. And now what we're going to do as well is remove the flesh of the tomato. So with a sharp knife, I'm just going to work my knife, of course removing that membrane with the seeds, because that we're not going to be incorporating into our recipe. But you can of course keep this and use it for any particular preparation of any other dishes in the future. And you can also puree it and keep it in the refrigerator. And also add it to your soups and stocks, especially when you're going to be making those fresh from your very own kitchen. So just finish off with the last piece. And as you can notice, very, very simple, nice, beautiful, clean tomatoes at this stage. But before we begin to chop those, very importantly, proceed to check your rice. Should actually also make sure at this stage that there's not any bits of rocks or dirt inside the mixture. And once that's completely checked, you can proceed to add that to your pot with the stock. Proceed to also scoop out the little bit of rice that's still left in your bowl. Remember, this is still very edible, and you definitely do not want to waste any of that. Right, as your rice continues, we're going to just give that a quick mix, making sure, of course, that the rice is completely submerged in the stock. And of course, as I mentioned, very important to give it a bit of color at this stage. I'm going to add about a 3/4 teaspoon of some turmeric powder, and I'm just going to mix that very simply with a spoon. And all you need to do at this stage is allow for your rice to cook, which should take you anywhere between 6 to 8 minutes for a portion that size. And I'm also going to proceed to discard the rest of my tomatoes, which I'm of course possibly going to use a little later. Now next up, begin by julienning your tomatoes. And by julienne, this basically means cutting it into very thin strips. This will make it easy to slice that into some very evenly sized cubes as well. You just proceed to do so to the very, very end. Of course, using a sharp knife will make it quite easy. And for some of you wondering where the recipe comes from, this is a very, very simply inspired recipe from the coastal part of Kenya. It's actually also a very, very good breakfast alternative. Of course, if you're looking at having this in the morning, and it also works quite well, especially into the nighttime. You can be able to serve this with an array of starches. You can also be able to serve that with some homemade chapati or some naan bread. It will really, really go well. Right, once your tomatoes are chopped up, very importantly, begin also to grab your garlic, and you can just slide everything to one side of your board. Now I'm just going to break a few cloves of garlic off by hand. And very simply, using your fingertips, proceed to separate the skin of the garlic from the garlic cloves. So about 3 pieces of garlic will do for this recipe. And you can discard the rest. Right, now very simply, once peeled, proceed to slice right through the middle once. Of course, slicing lengthways. And you can turn those flat onto the board. You can slice about 3 to 4 pieces at a time. Of course, making sure that the garlic is sitting flat on your board will, of course, give you a bit of leverage in chopping. Once your garlic is nicely sliced up, proceed to also chop that a little finer. Of course, just making sure that your garlic is as finely chopped as you possibly can get it. And you can, of course, proceed to get that much finer, or give it a much finer consistency by using a pestle and mortar. So you can simply just move that into your mortar. Very, of course, important tip I could share. Always add a bit of salt in your mortar before proceeding to grind your garlic. It will, of course, save you a bit of time, and it will make it much easier. Right, so basically our condiments are ready. We're just basically going to give that a few minutes for the beans to cook through. Our rice is also almost cooked through, so we're also going to give that a few minutes, which will of course take us into the first break of the show. But we are going to come back very briefly, and we are going to show you what the beans look like once they are cooked. We're of course going to cool them down before proceeding to make our coconut beans. But please don't touch that dial. You definitely want to see the last and final part of the show. See you in a little while. Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who are just catching up, we started this very simple recipe by boiling our beans, which are now ready to cook. And we've also managed to make our coriander rice, which is also ready. So I'm just going to move this pot to the other side. And of course, we'll begin by decanting the beans from the big pot. Now, as I mentioned, very important to always remember to make sure that you clean your beans. Remember one very important thing to note. Beans are particularly a very common product that will, of course, be preserved for longer periods of time. And you can be able to find different kinds of these versions of preservative, either through beans that are, of course, canned, or beans that are actually treated with some chemical, which will, of course, keep weevils away. Now, very important to mention, when you're working with beans, very important to clean them quite properly, especially when you're going to be cooking them for your family. Now what I normally do from my end is I normally wash them on purchase and then soak them overnight. Then of course the process of cooking will of course sterilize your beans, allowing for the beans to be nice and beautiful for cooking. And of course it also makes sure that you have actually eliminated any traces of weevils or chemicals that could have actually been preserves for the beans before you bought them. Now these are now beautifully cooked, and I'll just show you very simple way of checking. Just begin by pressing it very firmly onto a board, and it should actually mash very simply, of course giving you the hint that you can now proceed to continue to cook. Now before we begin, very important to heat a pot up before you start your cooking process, and of course add to that about a tablespoon of some oil. Now basically allow your pot to come to the heat, and while doing so begin to add your condiments, beginning with the garlic that you minced up a little earlier. So I'll begin by scooping my garlic to one end of my mortar, and you can proceed to add that to your pan. Right, as that continues, we're going to grab a wooden spoon and just proceed to work your garlic in the pan, of course giving it just a few seconds to sweat out that beautiful garlicky aroma. And once that's done, proceed to add your onions, and we're also going to allow those to sweat out a little bit. And at this stage I begin my cooking at medium to low heat, and this is basically just to allow for the beautiful fragrances to develop in your pan, and it also of course aids in making sure that you don't actually begin by burning or overcooking your onions. Right, so once those are beautifully golden brown, we're going to proceed to add our beans. And this particular stage will of course allow for your beans to begin to get that beautiful flavor from the garlic and the onion. Also allows for your beans to begin the final cooking process. And this is basically where you infuse most of your flavor. So for that I'm going to be aiding my cooking with a bit of some stock that we made earlier. And what happens is stock also brings that beautiful vibrant flavor of vegetable to your dish, and of course it is also a more nutritious and a more healthy way of cooking as opposed to using water. Alright, so as your beans continue to cook, very simply proceed to begin your plating. So I'm just going to begin by grabbing a nice big plate, and what we're going to do is we'll begin by spooning over our rice. So very simply, once your rice is cooked, very important to always fluff it up, and you can achieve this by using the front tip of your spoon. And basically what you're doing is just lifting the rice from the bottom of the pot, just by showing you what the rice looks like. I'll just begin by just pouring it onto the plate, and you can be able to get that nice beautiful aroma coming through from the coriander. You can also be able to see that beautiful texture of your rice, nice and fluffy, and a very particularly good consistency to look forward to, especially when making that beautiful bowl of rice. So simple as that. I'm of course going to grab a different plate which we are going to be plating our meal onto today. And I'll proceed to scoop that onto the plate. I'm just going to use one end of the plate for this process. So about 2 heaped spoons should do for one adult portion. Of course, nutritionally, that would be the perfect recommendation. And now you will of course be able to notice that your beans will start to puff out quite a bit, especially after adding a bit of stock. That will of course be your cue to proceed to add your tomatoes. And basically we can turn our heat up a little higher to the highest possible temperature level on your gas burner. And while that continues, I'm also going to proceed to add my tomato paste. Now what happens is this basically brings a nice nutritional balance to your flavors. It also aids in getting that mixture to thicken up beautifully. And it also harmonizes the flavors of your stock, your garlic and your onions. All you need to do at this stage is continue to mix through right up until your tomato puree is completely absorbed in the mixture. And the beans will of course have a nice beautiful coloring at this stage. Then pretty much proceed to add your final ingredients, which of course are your fresh coriander herb. So I'll begin by slicing off the stem end of the coriander, and I'm only going to use the leaves. So just proceed to shred those very, very coarsely. Proceed to add those to your pot. And you can proceed to reserve the stems. These are particularly very, very good to add in your stock pot. So you can of course be able to use those in many different other techniques of cooking. But for this recipe you will not require them at all. Right, so if you can be able to get the color of the meal at the moment from the cameras there, you can see that nice, beautiful, rich red color coming through. And of course this stage of course also shows you that your tomatoes are of course completely broken down, giving you of course your last call to add your coconut milk. So I'm just going to add about a full cup of coconut milk of course. Then of course, very important to make sure not to waste. You can proceed to rinse off the same glass you used to weigh out your milk. And just add that to your pot. And give that a very, very slow mix, allowing it to proceed to finish off the last and final part of the cooking process. Now some other suggestions I could also share with this recipe. If you're of course a big fan of some spices, you can of course also go in with a bit of chili. So I'm going to be using some chili flakes for that, but I will add a very, very small pinch, as I'm not a big fan of eating chilies myself. And this basically gives it a nice beautiful burst of heat. Also allows for you to be able to get that beautiful flavor going through your meal right through to the last and final spoon. And at this stage you should actually have a nice beautiful coconutty aroma coming through. We are of course going to season that with some salt. And I'm also going to go in with some stock powder. Now for some of you who may not be able to tell the difference between stock and stock powder, stock is basically just the water that is left over after boiling over some vegetables. And that should take you about 10 to 15 minutes of cooking time. And it's a very, very simple process of a combination of celery, carrots, leeks, and of course onions. And you can be able to use that in place of water, especially when cooking. But of course, if you are quite strapped for time, you can be able to purchase some stock powder in the market. A good example that most of us use locally is Royco powder. It's also a very, very good substitute for stock. So we're going to add just 1 teaspoon of some Royco powder. Now proceed to mix that through once more, right up until the Royco is almost completely absorbed. And as I mentioned, it is going to take you just a few minutes to thicken the mixture once coconut has gone in. So very, very important to also mention, if you are going to be making coconut beans, be sure that your beans are properly cooked, just to be able to make sure that you don't actually evaporate all of your coconut mixture. Now, coming to the last and final part of the cooking process, you can proceed to lower your temperature just a little bit. And of course, very important, continue to mix the mixture right until the last and final part of plating, because it's actually very, very easy to get this to burn, especially from the base. And of course, giving it a mixture continuously also allows it to really, really manage to cook through. You actually disperse the temperature in the pan more evenly, and you actually have control over your mixture. It's actually very, very easy to make sure that your consistency doesn't change at this stage. Right, so this is almost done. Should be about 4 to 5 minutes away, giving you just enough time to grab a plate. Now you can of course go with different options, like serving your beans in a bowl, or you can of course serve them directly onto your plate of choice. But I am going to spoon out just a bit of the mixture. You can of course turn this off at this stage, and your coconut beans are now ready to serve. So I'm going to begin the plating by scooping some of the beans into my plate of choice. Beautiful aroma coming through, and that you can pretty much place on the side of your plate like that. And you can finish that off very simply by tearing over some coriander leaves, and that just gives it a nice beautiful burst of color. And last but not least, a bit of some chili flakes just to give it a bit of color. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my very simple take on coconut beans with coriander rice. I do hope you've had some fun today in the show, and you've probably managed to grasp something that you can be able to use in your very own home kitchen. But we have, of course, come to the last part of the show, where I will, of course, give you my regards for tuning in today and making time to join us on the show. And I will also remind you that you can, of course, also air your comments, your views, or any suggestions that pertain the show through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And of course, if you have missed out on this episode, you can be able to recap on this and more on our YouTube page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya, where we've got plenty more videos for you to be able to catch up on. But for now, we will bid you farewell, thanking you once again for making time. And until the next episode, God bless and bye-bye.